Guys, happy Thursday. For this next podcast, we're lucky to have Luke Thomas, the founder and CEO of Friday.app. I hand over to my colleague Mia, who can kick things off.
Yeah. Hi, Luke. And Wyckoff. Thanks for the introduction. Luke, happy to have you on our podcast. Thanks for joining. And before we dive into anything, I think both of us playing in the remote space, we'd love to see real time a demo of your product as you kind of give an overview of why you started it, what pain points were you feeling, and what value do you add to your users.
Cool. Yeah. Happy to give a quick overview. Um, I've worked remotely for 6 or 7 years at this point for a few different companies, and I would always kind of run into the same issue over and over again, no matter where I worked. The general idea was that it was difficult to understand what everyone was working on. It was difficult to understand why or how my work fit into the bigger picture, and oftentimes it was difficult to get to know the people that I worked with. And so I originally started Friday with the goal of improving employee to manager feedback and communication through this automated kind of cadence around sharing what went well and what didn't go so well for your week. But came to the conclusion that really what separated some of the great experiences I personally had and the great teams that I worked on from the other ones was this idea that you should really create structure and process to the way that you communicate. And to do it in a way that really flexible nature of remote work. And so what we try to do is we help you automate routine communication and updates at work. And we use that as a jumping off point to create this kind of like intranet feeling product where you can quickly understand what's going on at work from a high level. So you can spend a little bit less time in meetings, or you can just save, that meeting time for those really rich discussions where you're collaborating, where you're building better relationships, everything that Remote HQ helps with. So that's really kind of the quick tour of Friday and why we exist as a company. We're just trying to make work better, and we think the best way to push the boundaries is by building something for distributed teams in particular, especially with all this craziness with COVID.
hmm And you mentioned that you initially started with this idea of to better the communication style between manager directly to their employee. And could you speak a little bit to more how that's evolved to empowering the whole team to keep them connected, especially now, like you said, during COVID, as I'm sure the culture needs to be there?
Yeah, so the product was originally geared around like a weekly check-in that happened on a Friday. So you'd share what you accomplished for the week, how you felt about the week. It was kind of this looking back overview of the week, almost like a reflection. And that worked pretty well. But what we found were that a lot of our customers would uh, sometimes they'd outgrow that communication cadence. Sometimes they had other communication cadences that they ran. So, for example, maybe they do some type of Monday prioritization where it's not looking back, it's looking forward. Maybe they're doing daily stand ups. But in most of these scenarios, it was this routine communication, routine update. They were kind of manually cobbling together processes. And so what we did was we took a step back. This was, probably like a little over a year ago at this point, and said, why don't we create a fully customizable tool to automate any routine communication or update at work so that even if you outgrow a specific routine, you can still use Friday to stay connected and understand what's going on. And so that's kind of how the product's evolved. People still use it for that employee to manager use case, but that's
hmm
one of many use cases people are using now.
Yeah. And now I better understand the name of the company now too, Friday looking back. But I love that I think as communication is ever evolving, and especially now where more communication is probably better, that you have that expansion for growth within the company to be able to use your product to not only look back but look forward and proactively plan as well.
Yeah, that's certainly the point. The goal is, to help you create a system to the way that you communicate, right?
hmm
What people are what I think people really want is, you certainly need unstructured communication. You certainly need to, have those brainstorming sessions, but there also needs to be a way when you're sharing information, when you're sharing updates, you actually want predictability. And the best way to get predictability in your communication is to have a computer do most of the work for you. And so then information flows up, down, and across the company on a consistent basis. Think of it almost like plumbing in a house. You have your pipes and you have water that flows through, but you still need pumps to maintain the flow. And we think of Friday as like this set of communication pumps for your company.
It's a very good analogy, and it's helpful to paint the picture for it. So I appreciate you sharing that. And kind of jumping back a little bit and more from Friday, but to actually your personal background, I know you shared that you work 6 to 7 years remotely, and I saw on your personal website that you describe yourself as a marketer with a love for building stuff. And I just thought that was such a neat phrase and a unique background to come from as well. So my next question is more around like when did you begin to have the itch to build things, and what made you start scratching from your marketing background to now your building background?
It's a long story, but I'll try to keep it short. The general idea, or the kind of the story is, in high school I started building websites. Discovered, when I built a website for a client, what they actually wanted were more customers. The website was a means to an end, right? And I started getting more and more involved in tech, learned marketing, decided, well, I should probably learn how to build, web apps as well. So I taught myself how to program at least just enough. I graduated school with a business degree, moved to Boston, worked in growth, kind of really fell in love with the idea of almost like thinking like an engineer, but applying it to marketing, right? How do you create systems, once again, systems for driving customer acquisition, driving growth? And I ended up falling into, growth, which then ended up being more product. And so I consider myself more product these days because I see product as one of the primary mechanisms to drive growth, especially in kind of this product-led world of software. But yeah, it's kind of a long, winding history. But what I really enjoy doing personally is it's fun to be working in areas where there's ambiguity. And a startup is probably like if there's too much structure, I just get bored. And so a startup is kind of a natural home for people where there's just a ton of white space.
I love that's one of my favorite parts about it too. And you actually started touching on my next question, which was about to be how do you leverage that background in product and growth? Now wearing your founder hat, I've seen a lot of builders make that transition from a product background to then starting their own company because it sets the strategy moving forward, and you're able to leverage the experience you've had when working with numerous teams while setting strategy and so forth. So, do you have any major polls as to what came from that background and what made you succeed as a founder and building so far today?
Well, I mean, it's the verdict is still out, right? It's going to take some time to see if I'm right or not. But what I can tell you, it's really interesting. Essentially, what I learned working in a bunch of different startups was not that many startups have product market fit, right? And so if you come in and you are just like kind of pouring gas or pouring water into the bucket, but the bucket has holes, you're kind of wasting your time. And so I've seen companies where they're just spending crazy amounts of money on paid acquisition and all this top of the funnel activities, and it's all, most of it is falling out the other end. And so what I determined when I started Friday was I need to figure out and I need to focus most of my energy, maybe not all of it, but most of my energy on making sure that the bucket holds water. And so what's kind of interesting is, pre-product market fit, you're still in searching. And so a lot of this like top of the funnel, scalable growth, it doesn't matter as much until you figure out how to plug those holes. And so, but at the same time, a lot of founders, a lot of startups build product trying to find the fit, and they then proceed to think about growth. And then at that point, they're probably going to have to go back, reconfigure the product so that it maps to the customer acquisition channels and customer acquisition kind of strategies to drive the growth. And so the way I think about it is, we're still building product, but you constantly are kind of zooming in, zooming out and saying, how does this fit into the broader theme of scalable go-to-market? And so that's kind of how I guess my past has layered into the present. But most startups, they just don't have product market fit. And so, I just determined that I would allocate most of my attention to make sure that that wasn't the case with Friday.
Yeah, Luke, actually, on that's actually a really great insight because I think you're right. I think mainstream trade and tech press, tend to celebrate, you know, all the growth KPIs, right? And what a lot of people don't realize is that, you know, you can get growth by throwing a lot of money at it, right? You know, we've seen this in Fab.com and you name it, right? The moment you stop spending, that curve is gonna go negative. And I'm curious here that do you feel like this insight is it's a rare or it's one of those rare things that you think most founders don't don't see or don't think that way just because you know also I feel like a lot of investors also when they come in there's you know all these vanity metrics, right? Whether it's MAU, DAUs, you know, I think do you feel like founders generally have a lot of pressure to go, boy, now we've raised money or we've raised meaningful amount of money, we got to start showing MAU growth and DAU growth, and it doesn't really matter whether it's product led or we're just buying users.
Yeah, so I think there's a couple pieces of the puzzle. So the first is oftentimes you have founders who maybe like haven't been in the trenches on go to market and growth in particular, and so they have these kind of like they almost think of growth as this thing that you can kind of just throw money at, right? And it's like, and in reality, it yeah. So gosh, it's such an interesting question because I have quite a few thoughts on this. The first is you have founders that don't have a ton of experience on go to market, and so they just kind of assume that, oh, if I hire like a growth person, they'll just kind of sprinkle money into these 5 different channels, and like they'll probably all work. Where in reality, like maybe one or maybe 2, 3, you have a heck of a business as long as the bucket's holding water. And so you have some inexperience there. The second is you have kind of the looming threat of competition, or you kind of have this like FOMO, right? And you want to show progress. And one way of doing it is by raising a nice round and pouring a bunch of it into activity that may not lead to actual output. The third, I think, is actually like incentives, right? And so you have an incentive as a founder to kind of pursue activities that show like that top line growth. And it's not actually that easy to say, hey, like we're not ready for more money, or we're not ready to like just hire a bunch of people, right? And so as a founder, you don't want to look bad, or you don't want to look like you're not ready for that. Meanwhile, you have investors with time horizons, and so you're going to try to pursue. You're going to try to do what you can to compress that, which I can understand. Like that's the name of the game, but it leads to scenarios where people just spend a ton of money in unproductive ways. And so that's kind of my rationale for why this is the case. But I can't tell you how many startups I've talked to where they've hired a growth person. That growth person has spent way too much money on customer acquisition, and they have very little to show for it. Like that happens way more often than it doesn't.
And I think it clicks too on the second biggest reason that startups fail is because they're solving a problem that doesn't exist, and they're building a product. Maybe their heads down deep for 2 years and it hasn't been identified for a sole purpose or a sole pain point. So I think you're right to be thinking that way and challenging the pipeline of your work and identifying the bucket and then plugging the holes in it first. I think that's a great way of thinking.
Cool.
Kind of switching gears a little bit, I actually came across your Medium article recently that talked about the new rules of the modern workplace. And I was such a fan. I'll have to make sure to hyperlink it in the YouTube article description and the article we write up on this. But could you please double click on like what precisely needs to change to allow for that flexible work that you were sharing within that article?
Yeah, sure. So the kind of the theme of the article is that there's these kind of at a high on the surface there's these signals, things like remote work, things like being able to work from home a few days a week, being able to kind of work when you want. There's kind of this shift in a variety of ways towards what I call the more flexible workplace, which is not the idea that you work 2 days a week for in general, but it's more that the workplace, you have these pretty skilled people doing work, and you have to kind of like build work around that reality. And for me, I really enjoy working early in the morning, and in the afternoon, like call it 3 p.m. on, I'm useless. And other people on my team, it's almost the exact opposite. And so you have this shift, and you have these people that are like, okay, I want swim lanes to be able to do my best work, and that is different from the people that I work with. And so, that to me is why remote work is so popular. It's not literally the fact that I can sit at home. It's that I have more flexibility in my life to take maybe a break at noon, or not noon, but like 3 p.m. in the afternoon, and like step away from the work. Um, and so I see remote work as kind of that surface level thing towards a more flexible workplace. And so if the flexible workplace is the nugget of what the future looks like, then how do we go about actually getting there? And from my perspective, the way I think we get there is by kind of analyzing the frequency and the way that we communicate at work. Because if we're, as knowledge workers, like most of our time spent talking with our coworkers, or a non-trivial amount of time is spent talking and communicating, coordinating, and all that fun stuff. And so if most of that requires that, a group of people, whether it's two or more, be present at the same moment in time, you create these dependencies to moving the ball forward and work. And so if that is the case, then maybe we should analyze all those real-time conversations that we have and start to kind of map the communication channel to the job at hand. And so specifically, in the office, maybe like 80% of your time is spent real-time chatter. The shoulder taps, the water cooler conversations, the meetings, the conference rooms, all that fun stuff, or not so fun stuff. And what we see from some of the highly productive, fast scaling, fast growing remote first companies is that they've essentially flipped it on its head, where they say, okay, we want to create a flexible workplace. We want to create swim lanes for our employees to do their best work. What we need to do is we need to shift the burden away from the real time to a more asynchronous or flexible environment. Now, that does not mean just eliminating meetings and not talking in real life, because there's value to that, right? There's value to resolve thorny issues, to build better relationships, to collaborate, to do the whiteboarding type stuff. But what it does mean is a lot of your meetings probably could have been emails, or what I like to say is a Friday update, right? If it's just information sharing, if it's not very ambiguous, well, you should just share that information asynchronously. And you should save your meetings or your real-time conversations for when they matter most. And if you can do that, well, then all of a sudden you give people time and more flexibility to do their best work, no matter what time of day that looks like. And so that's kind of the thesis for how we operate. And internally at Friday, we have one routine meeting every 2 weeks. I have one-on-one actually technically every Monday, but most of the time, we have these communication and updates that we send through, and we will still have our ad hoc meetings, but we treat those as a place where we can, resolve those thorny issues or build better relationships.
Do you find that as you talk to folks who are adjusting to remote work, sort of finding the right cadence between synchronous and asynchronous modalities and what that process looks like, do you find that that's one of the bigger challenges for teams, to kind of formalizing and codifying that?
Yeah, so I think that's one of the big pressing challenges is essentially, if you look at a lot of the advice on the internet around remote work, and, it's what I guess I would call more foundational advice. It's like, hey, you should have a wiki and you should document like your company operating procedures and all that fun stuff. And it's like, yes, like, yes, definitely do that. But I think what people are kind of looking for is maybe like the gateway drug to that. And so if they spend a lot of their day right now on Slack or in Zoom, it's like, where is that wedge, or like, where is that, where's that first initial step, right? That isn't too far of a departure from what they're doing now, but is just enough to get you on that kind of slippery slope, so to speak, towards more asynchronous communication. And I certainly think Friday plays a role in that. If I didn't think that, I wouldn't be working on it. But for us, it's about saying, hey, maybe you're doing your Monday morning team kickoffs or your daily stand-ups, and it's like, yes, you maybe should keep doing that, assuming it's somewhat inefficient. But maybe you should use Friday to collect the updates before the thing happens,
Right.
and then you can walk into your meetings and you can save a ton of time because the updates are already documented in front of you, which can be this wonderful running log of what's happening over time. And so it's maybe not necessarily, at least in the early days, it's not about completely replacing your meetings. It's about saying, hey, this hour-long meeting is 45 minutes updates. What if we just do the updates asynchronously and then talk about the blockers instead? So yeah, that's kind of that's how we think about it.
Interesting.
And my initial reaction to that is that it must be such a behavior change for team members to start questioning what of their meetings are updates and what is for discussion and decision making. And it's also hard because people might have differing opinions about that. How do you see people, one, educating themselves about that? And then also with the new environment we're living in with the national pandemic, do you see behaviors adapting more easily to, oh, maybe we don't need as many meetings because you're right, this is all updates?
Yeah, so, and this is kind of why I think people really haven't, if something was plainly obvious, people probably would have adapted long before now, especially when it comes to meetings. But what happens is you have these, routine meetings in particular, where there's a similar format, there's a template to the way that things happen. But what happens is you kind of have this mishmash of updates and resolving blockers, right? And so what a lot of people do is they throw it in a Google Doc, agenda items for your meeting. People do that, and people are certainly doing that more now than they ever have. But it's just throwing agendas in a document. You still have to share more about what the heck that agenda item actually means. And so what we do is we're hey, if you get a richer update, it's not an agenda item. If you get a richer update, you actually will feel a lot more prepared and aware of what's going on, and you will not spend as much time asking people what they're working on. I spent so much time in meetings just my head in my face palm, where it's let's go around in a circle sharing what we're working on. It's oh my gosh, I could be doing work right now. So anyway, yeah, it's kind of this. It certainly is some behavior change, but that's why we try to automate as much of the process as possible. So then it becomes this kind of more predictable cadence. Because right now, people are gluing together calendar reminders, Google Docs, manual reminders, asking people to fill out updates. So we just try to automate it. And so yeah, that's it's not a huge departure, but killing the entire meeting is. And so it's how do you get to the middle ground?
Yeah, and I like what you suggested too by maybe teasing out your hour-long meeting. Maybe it goes to 30 minutes and then eventually to 15 minutes. So it's step by step. And I think the key words you're playing back that I hear a lot is automate it, make it predictable, and have the consistency there, and leverage technology and the computer to do that.
Yeah, exactly. We recently did a survey, and half of our users, at least the ones that filled out the survey, say that Friday helps them save at least an hour a week. And so, some of a meaningful portion of that 50% saves at least 2 hours a week. And so we're not done yet. We have a lot more work to do, but I get excited about that because, you can't, time is one of your most valuable things. And if we can give you back a little bit more of your day to do work that you find really interesting, that's pretty cool. I like that.
We're all a fan of it. And I think as my final question, as an advocate of remote work, and maybe not fully remote work, but thinking about the hybrid model that is increasingly being talked about where you do some at home, some at work, also work on your own time, what are the 3 words you would say would be the reasonings why you would encourage someone to work flexibly?
Can I make it more than 3 words?
Yes, I'll get you a few extra.
Yeah, so I really think it's about integrating kind of work and life, I guess. And And so if we want to build a place where, people can do their best work and can do it in a way where, if you have to take a break to go visit like an aging parent, like that just feels better for society,
Mhm.
and so sure, like remote work is not like going to cure all your problems, but it's definitely made my life a lot better. Like I hear my kid crying right now. It's maybe not the best thing, but it's kind of cool to be able to take a lunch break and hang out with my son. That is worth the pay cut. That's worth living in a place where I want to live. I didn't like living in the city. I was always claustrophobic. I hated it, and to me, it's helped me, and it feels. I grew up in the middle of nowhere too. I'd like to be able to maybe move a little bit further out in the country and still do meaningful work. I think that's good for society, and it helps level the playing field. And so that's what gets me excited about the space.
That's great. Micah, do you have any remaining questions?
Yeah, I only have one last one. And Luke, you talk to a lot of folks who are veterans in remote work and newbies who are now forced to work remotely because of COVID-19. I'm curious, what is the most? I'll tell you what we've seen.
Sure.
What is the most interesting work-life split or balance or flexibility that you've seen of all the people you have talked to? I'll give you the version that we've seen. Actually, our last podcast with Ivo Sapar, who is the founder and CEO of RemoteHQ. You might know him. I've known Ivo for the last couple of years, and one of the things that struck me of Ivo was he and his team are digital nomads. I think every time I speak to Ivo, he's either in one exotic locale or another. I think the last time he was in Hanoi, no, Hoi An in Vietnam. I don't know where that is, by the way. He showed me the map. He showed me that it's in the middle of the country. And I think before that, when I spoke to him, he was in Bali, and I think before that, it was in Bangkok. So anyway, I thought that was really cool. I couldn't do it because I have kids and a family, but to me, that is such a microcosm of the flexibility that you talked about. I'm curious, what have you seen in folks that you have talked to in terms of, wow, this is really cool. I wish, people who haven't thought about this would come and do this and they would find it really meaningful and exciting too.
Yeah, so I'll share a couple quick anecdotes. The first is, I guess, myself. So a couple years ago, my wife and I, we both worked remotely. We spent like a month in the middle of winter, which it gets cold up here in Maine. We spent a month in Austin, Texas, and a month in Nashville. And it was like, we still look back at that and are just like, that was awesome. We stayed a month in a couple Airbnbs. We avoided the winter. We met some new people. It was a ton of fun. And the second example is a good friend of mine. He lives about an hour north of me. He moved from Philadelphia. He works for a well-known tech company, and he gets up almost every day, and he will go fishing on the ocean between like, I think he gets up at like 3:30 or something. He'll start fishing at 4 a.m. in the morning. He'll get back. He'll start working, 9, and he's already had a ton of fun, and it's then time to work, and he's able to do his best work. And he gets to live where he wants. He gets to live near the fish. And so, I mean, that's just a cool example of what happens when you're not bound to meetings all day and Zoom calls.
Yeah.
It's like you just can't do that if you're just sitting in a conference call all day long. Save that for when it matters.
Yeah. 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 Now, those are interesting examples, and I think hopefully more and more people get to experience that and realize that a lot more freedom in different directions. So, well, with that, thank you so much. Appreciate you being generous with your time. This is awesome, and for all the audience here, please go check out Friday.app. It's a really cool app. I think it could really help you automate a lot of things that Luke talked about. Give it a try. And with that, thank you and happy Thursday. We'll talk soon.
Yeah, thanks for having me on. It was a ton of fun.
Thanks,
Bye.
Luke.
Okay, see ya.